All right, welcome to episode 4 of Education in Color. I'm joined here today by Ife, founder and CEO of Pink Cornrows and previous executive deputy director of YMI, also known as Young Men's Initiative. Ife?
Hi, how are you? I usually say my full name.
So I would say, cut, let's redo it, but you know what?
No.
You could tell me.
I'll tell you.
I didn't want to mispronounce it because some people mispronounce mine.
I'll tell you right now.
Cool.
Keep it running.
Oh, yeah.
No, my name, first of all, thank you for inviting me. And I think because we've just been like vibing for so long that you felt comfortable. But my mama would hit me if I didn't say my full name. My full name is Ifeomasinachi Ike. Everyone calls me Ifeoma or Ife. And yeah, really excited to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you so much for that. Now we're just going to dive right into our first question, which is, what was your educational experience like growing up, and what was your relationship with school and education in general?
Yeah, I'll keep it as short as I can, being a Nigerian American, which is to say, in general, education was just like really huge in our family. I think I had an extra burden being the oldest of 5. So when you're the oldest of 5 in an immigrant household, it's very much you have to set the tone, set the example. And so I'm not gonna lie, I felt like I both enjoyed school and I always felt like a little bit of stress with school, because I knew that I could not necessarily get below a B in any course, and even a B would get questioned. And I think I was just so focused on, like, I don't want to disappoint my family, and I want to make sure that I'm able to, perform well. I think as I've gotten older, like many of us, we've reflected more on our educational experiences. And the reality is, I had a blend of public experience. Well, I'll even start before that. I've gone through Head Start. I've gone through public school, but I've also gone through private school, back to public school. And I think that I'm able to see a little bit more how a lot of childhood can kind of get stripped away during an educational process where you're a young person in racist systems, but you don't necessarily know it's a racist system. You're just experiencing maybe unfairness. You're experiencing like lack of resources, lack of support, lack of attention. And I think in some ways, I'm pretty lucky that I was blind to that and came out on the other side. But I'm very well aware that there are individuals who went to the same exact schools as I did and had a very different experience, even got different guidance as to where they were going to go after high school. So high school in a word was cool. It was cool, but there were a lot of uncool moments, and I just know that in those moments I have vivid memories of times when I kind of like revolted, and there were consequences. And then I also had times when I was rewarded, because when you're the kid that also is put into these special programs, whether it's gifted and talented or whatever, then you also experience what it's like to be seen as, somewhat of quote unquote the smart kid. I was also an athlete. And so I think I kind of had a little bit of I wasn't a popular kid, but I was also like a jock in a way. So I kind of had that weird world of outlets outside of the classroom. So yeah, that was kind of my school experience.
Thank you for that. And just before we move on with the rest of the episode, I just want to set the record straight with one thing. So New York City Men Teach, and I'd be aloof to not mention this since I work with the organization. New York City Men Teach in many of its important facets, such as name, programmatic vision, and just the overall, functions of it. It was due to your ideas, correct? Because Shamira always credits it to you. And so it's the first time meeting you, and I'm just like, I'm me, the founder of New York City Men Teach, So can you just walk me through how did it come about?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm always going to lean into the both and of yes, I was with an amazing team that helped to ensure that equity as a whole was actualized within city government. at the time that I was hired to come into the city, nationally, we were going through an era where President Obama was still in office. My Brother's Keeper was a national initiative, and in a way, I had a weird connection to that as well, having worked on the Hill, and having at that time I was working as a counsel on Judiciary Committee when Trayvon Martin was murdered, and really just started thinking about like why are we in these spaces, right? I did like a little. Every year, Washington, D.C. has this Cherry Blossom Festival. And I remember the Saturday after my phone was flooded from my sister to everyone around me, like, what are we going to do about this in reference to Trayvon? And I really was like, I want everyone to stop texting me, because I don't think I was able to grapple with like the feeling of like, you know, this could have been my family member, this could have been my brothers, this could have been my dad, this could still be my family members, this could be any of us. And I was even more frustrated knowing that by the time we had heard about it as the public, like almost 2 months had gone by, right? So that was also really frustrating. For a lot of reasons. As an attorney, by that time I had already worked on some civil and human rights cases. So I didn't necessarily look at it like, oh my goodness, our system failed us. We live in New York City. I'll just leave it at that. And, I was in law school when Sean Bell was murdered, who was the young brother who was murdered the morning of his wedding. And he was murdered on my birthday, not too far from the law school that I went to. I went to CUNY Law School. So I was already on the path of being, politicized, if you will, around like where our solutions and where our help comes from. And I was very clear that it's not going to come from a mandate. It's not going to come from a law. It's not going to come from a policy. Individuals are going to have to make choices. And they're going to have to make choices in the spaces that they're in. And for those of us that are privileged enough, even if we don't have a high title or position, but if we're privileged enough to have access to tools that those who are experiencing the extreme versions of oppression are experiencing, then what can we do, even if it's just once, to disrupt the space? And after taking that walk, I remember like narrating it on Facebook, like this is a walk and a journey that Trayvon is never going to be able to experience. And something just clicked in my mind, and I went into my apartment and I just started like drafting like legislation, and I just started drafting bills. I was calling my friends that worked in different caucuses, whether it was the Congressional Black Caucus or the Congressional Progressive Caucus, like, is there anything we can do? Can we pass a law? Can we have a hearing? And some of them were like, whoa, iffy, like chill. But I'm just like, no, like if we're in these spaces and in these moments and we work in quote unquote the people's house, which is what they call Congress, shouldn't we be doing something on behalf of the people? So fast forward with that energy, like I worked with a friend of mine. We created what was called the Black Male Experience, and then we pushed for what is now the Congressional Caucus on Black Men and Boys. And at that time, we had caught word that the administration was also looking to have a national initiative. And I always say, folks, that I don't know if it's because of what we were doing. We also did the first congressional walkout with staffers. I literally, at that time, GChat was a thing. You see how we've evolved, but GChat was a thing. That was kind of how you got your messages out to your friends. And there were hoodies movements that were happening throughout the country. Million Hoodies was a movement organization led by young people to literally disrupt the day and say, like, no, we are Trayvon too. And there were these hoodies movements that I was really inspired by. And I'm like, well, F it. Is it just because we're in D.C. that we can't have a hoodie? So I put on my GChat, because you could like customize your messages. I put hoodies on the Hill. And then all of a sudden my GChat started blowing up and people were like, where? And I was like, oh, I ain't think that far. And then they were like, I'll be out there. And literally within like 13 hours that like I'll do the flyer, I'll get the permit, I'll do the, and so we, on a very hot afternoon, spring afternoon, we were on the steps of the Capitol with our hoodies, black, brown staffers out there, just like, you know, basically saying this could have actually been any of us, and we're going about it business as usual, and that's a problem. And I raised that just so you understand that that's the energy that I came with when I came into working in city government. In fact, by that time, I had already not only worked on that, I had met Lucia McBath, who was Jordan Davis's mother. That's often referred to as the loud music case, and worked with her all the way up until she got into Congress, like worked on helping her to get into Congress. I had been on the ground in Ferguson. So I didn't come into the city to play. I came into the city really thinking we need to make sure that every opportunity we have to advance equity, that we take advantage of that opportunity. Before I came, though, I did not know that then Mayor de Blasio had made an announcement that we're going to recruit 1,000 Black and brown teachers, and we're going to bring them in here in 3 years. So when that came on my lap, before I went to law school, I was a researcher. So I was just looking at this like, what country of melanin are y'all going to find?
All these people to just be like, oh yeah, I'm going to be a teacher.
Like, I in my mind, I was like, what? And so honestly, when I started working on this, so as brave as I'm framing that I was feeling on one end, on the other end, I was like, I don't know if this is statistically possible. Right. So I actually started doing a white paper to honestly prove to the city that we couldn't do it. No lie.
Yeah.
I did a white paper. I did the research. I was like, this is how many people that we know of that get hired. This is how many people also leave the profession. Like, how are we going to stop? Even if we brought in 1,000, we're not stopping the flow. So the flow out. So I really, really wrote this white paper, this research paper. This is the number of times that people tried in the past. They got shut down. Like, I was just like, we're not going to be able to do this. And we were working on some other really dope projects in my role. So I was like, maybe if we show them that these projects are what we should focus on. We were able to like transform AmeriCorps into what we called Read More Corps. So if you had an AmeriCorps like scholarship or fellowship, you could also support and the capacity of literacy readers and the schools, like all these dope things. And then my boss, who's now the CEO of Robin Hood, Deputy Mayor Richard Beery at the time, he was like, yeah, this is all good. Where's my teacher recruitment strategy? And so I was like, well, here's your white paper. And what ended up happening is he was reading it, and there was some research that I brought up. There were two pieces of research that stood out to him. The first was there's not a lot of research around Black and brown teachers, male teachers, period. And so that stood out. But there was like this obscure research that focused on teachers, either Howard University did the research, or it focused on students that were at Howard University, and it was well before the 80s, so maybe in the 60s or 70s. But what they found out from specifically Black men was that Black men, there was a period of time where there were a lot of Black male teachers, and that makes sense. Brown versus Board of Education, when schools were segregated, right? Black adults were the ones teaching students, and regardless of certification or whatever.
Because I guess like the segregation didn't stop at just the students; it was also with the staff.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you're in an all-Black school, or let me put it the other way, if you're not allowed to go to an all-white school, then that means that in the schools, in the spaces that you're in, there's a lot of neglect there. Like, the government didn't really necessarily care how Black kids were being educated, but the reality is community is community for a reason. The community stepped in. We had nothing but Black teachers. In fact, some of the downfall of Brown versus Board of Education, as much as people like to revere it, is that it literally erased Black teachers, right? Because when you integrate, the teachers who remain hired are the white teachers, but you completely get rid of these Black schools.
Right, because there was like two pools of teachers, and then when the integration happened, it was kind of like, all right, we'll go with this pool instead of the other.
Yeah, it's not like they integrated the teaching staff.
Right.
No, that's not what happened, right? And that's a complexity in itself as to what happens when people that were, systemically trained not to love you or your children are now the ones teaching your children, and the ones who always loved your children don't have a job to teach your children. So that was one myth that we had to demystify, which is that it's not that there were never Black male teachers. It was that there was a pool of teachers that were, fired basically with the Supreme Court case. But the second thing was learning all the stereotypes that exist around especially Black men around children. And a lot of that just stems from the racist tropes, connected to everything from the infamous movie Birth of a Nation to the tropes around black and brown individuals and the kind of savage stereotype of they're going to come and rape us and they're going to come harm us. And these are real things that are, I can only imagine, are also embarrassing for someone to say that somebody would automatically think that about me when all I want to do is make sure that young people are educated. And even to this day, we still see, almost a 0% existence of Black and brown male teachers from like pre-K to like fifth grade, right? So I'm presenting all this to the deputy mayor. I'm also showing that, like, based on small anecdotal insights from people that were in the schools, a lot of them were like, I don't know why I would go back to the school that treated me like shit. Like, real talk. They were just
like going back to the scene of crime to a degree.
Yeah, like, and then you want me to fix it. Like, what is that? And so again, I'm here like, see, you can't do it. And we can't do it in 3 years. What's next? And he was like, and it was actually, this is actually what stopped me. He was like, I have kids now in school. And when I think about it, they don't have anyone that looks like me teaching them. And I would like for that to change. And I was like, damn, I'm gonna have to do this. I'm gonna have to do this, right? And so I think it just was layered upon layered. I feel like my role was like part research. It was supposed to be the research to throw it away. It ended up being the backbone of like, how do we build on top of this? But to the credit of the team, it was also about how do you work with a team and delegate with a team as to like, this is the information we need to build our case, but also let's imagine what an ideal profession would look like outside of what we inherited. Because none of us have seen what a fair education system has looked like. Right. So it's hard to build something and trust that in a city this complicated, where you've got to deal with the education system, you got to deal with the City University of New York, you got to deal with the mayor's office and all these administrative spaces. You have to get everyone aligned on pushing their levers, their spaces, and in some ways their spaces of privilege to really focus on this demographic. So I feel like part of my job was like, yes, the design and making sure that we're looking at the full life course of everything from marketing and strategy. And I'm talking about, I was in the conversations down to the color, the name, the font. So
you're who I have to thank for my wardrobe just being black and orange, right?
Yeah, that's me. I almost came with my sweatshirt. I was like, should I go with my sweatshirt? I was like, nah, I want to wear a suit. But then, like, on the other side, as to like, even if somebody were to leave, can people still leave with dignity? Can they leave feeling like I served my time and I was treated with respect? Right. So there were a lot of things about the design of the program. For example, we call it the NOAA model. We encourage schools that if you're going to bring in one teacher from NYC Men Teach, you actually bring in two. The reason for being was that we didn't want any, we didn't want any man to feel like he was an island by himself.
Right.
We didn't want him to feel like he was doing this on his own. We wanted him to at least have some type of a cohort, some type of a partner, somebody that he could talk to when things get rough. So we were always thinking about the socio-emotional wholeness of that individual, not just the program, and not just trying to make some quota or some program, you know, make administrators look good. I could care two shits about that. And that came through too, through the program. I think there was a lot of there's a lot of ego when it comes to city government and just politics. And as you and I were talking before this, I think I would have been I think I would have even, there were definitely days I cried, but I think what I cried about was number one, nobody likes being mistreated as they're doing good work. That's just the reality. Yeah. But I think it was also like, these folks really don't know that they're not fighting me. Like, however you feel about Black women, however you feel about women of color, however you feel about Black people in general, and most people have not addressed their own biases. Every time people acted through those biases, whether they knew it or not, it slows us down. Yeah. And I was just frustrated that we are in a position to move strategies with the resources that we have, and because of ego, ignorance, racism, whatever it is, I've got to now deal with your emotions before we can get to the work. So anyway, that was like that was the fullness of the environment of what we were working with. I mean, you're here as somebody who's gone through the program. So every time I get a ping on LinkedIn or somebody is like, hey, today is NYC Men Teach Day. And I heard that you drafted the proclamation. And I'm like, yeah, congratulations, enjoy your day. Like it's not an ego thing for me, but it makes it, I'm definitely proud of it, right? Because there were so many obstacles that tried to shut it down.
Well, I'm gonna be real with you. I'm glad your white paper failed. I'm glad they were just like, you know what? Like, we're not gonna do that. We're gonna do this, because the first thought I had in my mind is, shit, I'd be out of a job right now if that failed. But then the second thought that I had was, wait a minute, my whole collegiate career would have been different if that was the case.
Wow.
Because I joined New York City Men Teach in 2017. Initially I went to school, I wanted to be an engineer. Then I was like, all right, let me do law. And then I was like, you know what? I don't want that. Let me just go be a teacher, right? And, I only taught for like a short amount of time, but still the program was great, because once I joined the program, I met so many people that were of a similar background, but then also engaged in conversation with me. I met mentors, I met program directors. But the thing is, then I worked with Men Teach in a part-time college assistant capacity. I did fellowships. I worked as a fellow, and then I worked as an ambassador, and then now I'm here full-time. So I'm thinking, I'm like, holy shit, Men Teach had like a decent chunk to play in my worldview being shaped.
Yeah.
And the thing is, right before the pandemic hit is when I didn't want to teach anymore. I was just like, I found out about finance and stuff, and I was like, screw this, I'm gonna make money, right? So then I made the money, but then I realized that doesn't do anything for you, because it's an ever-moving goalpost. Nothing's ever going to be enough. Then I started to think, well, what is going to be enough? Well, if you feed yourself soulfully, that will eventually be enough. You can feed yourself soulfully to the point where you'll be satiated and content, but you'll want more. Yeah. But it won't be like that insatiable greed you have with money. So then I taught for a little bit. I loved it. But then I was just like, I loved it, and I love my kids, but I felt like I needed to do something different.
It's okay.
Then I bugged the hell out of Shamir. Yo, give me a job. Came here, and then, like I said, as I'm talking to him, I'm just like, shit, there's so many different core moments that impacted what I've done to this point that probably would have been much different if your white paper went through. So again, I'm glad that shit did not go through. And if I ever see that white paper, I'm just gonna set fire to it.
I think I still don't set fire. I mean, I reference it, and I want to shout out, the Shamir Stevens. I want to shout out the Dr. Patrice Fentons. I want to shout out, like, all of these were individuals. We, Cyrus and I used to like talk about how like all of these were individuals that at one point were just like positions on a piece of paper. Like, we need to hire this person, we need to hire that person. So I always tell people, like, it's weird when I don't believe I'm a founder of NYC Men Teach, but I do believe I was a designer of it. But the people that came in really, like, I mean, they blew it out of the water. Yeah. Like Shamir with what his vision around what it means to build strong pipelines with HBCUs and, universities throughout the country. The energy that you have, to want to come in the program, but also figure yourself out and then go do your thing, but then also come back. And that means that a community was built. And Dr. Patrice Fenton at that time, like, her entire, like, doctoral thesis was around how do you support, motivate, encourage, and create these nurturing environments within the teaching profession. So our whole hub spoke model at NYC Men Teach, we're like, you all can find different spaces and places to convene, share ideas, and then spokes like go back out and pollinate into your schools. Like that came from like a lot of her ingenuity and the team that she was working with. And so, what I say about any successful program is like the team that comes in is just as important, because when you really trust teams, you don't micromanage. Yeah. You trust their ingenuity, you trust their innovation. And so you're right. Like I guess in hindsight, I'm always glad that my fear, because I have to take responsibility for it, that my fear in all the spaces and the individuals that I did not see as team was not what shut the program down. That there was enough encouragement that was like, build the team that you need, and like enough, just like not enough time, and just thankfully my ego didn't take over to just be like, trust what they're gonna build. So NYC Men Teach is really, in my opinion, one of the strongest strategies that I've been a part of building and co-building with individuals that had their own, that also were like waiting for a moment like this, right? But I don't want to take away from what you just stated, that there aren't too many professions that you can go into, leave, step out, still remain in contact, in good relationship, and then come back. And even just all of this is an extension of like, there's another layer to this. Like, how do we tell stories? How do we get people to connect in different ways? How do we share new ideas as to how we evolve in education? That really does have to start from somewhere. Yeah.
And for me, the piece that I love the most that you're talking about was the community piece, because I was thinking about, I was like, wait a minute, a lot of the people that I deem very close to me are people that I met from the program. One of my closest friends, well, he was my mentor, then he's now my friend, Milton. He was an ambassador at City College. The program director over there, Walter, there was a time when there was like a traumatic event that happened, like 2019. And I came in the next day, and I just like hugged him. I told him, yo, I need a hug. I started crying, and he was like, consoling me. Yeah. And then the thing that I realized, the reason why I wanted to come, because it was funny, because in 2020 after that I was like, man, screw this shit. I'm not doing, I don't care. I just want to do whatever I want to do. Yeah. But then again, when it came to that self-actualization, that realization that I want to give back, well, what better place to give back than the place that, like you said, was building those nurturing spaces. Yeah. I never felt like when I was in these spaces it was very forced. It was always like a genuine interaction. And then I made sure that when I one summer when I was an ambassador for the summer fellowship, I had a workshop on toxic masculinity. And during that workshop, I have a cohort like 30 dudes, and now they all start opening up. They're all opening up about experiences of when they've been bullied, when their feelings have been invalidated. They're crying. We're all hugging each other. I'm like, this is wild. Yeah. But then the thing is, there's so much pent up trauma, depression, and just anger within us. And we don't have the spaces to really be who we are. Right. But now we do. And then, like I said, like you just talking about, it just makes me realize that those names on a piece of paper, that idea, it's crazy what one idea could become if you pick the right people. Right. You pick the right champions. Because like you're saying, Shamir, crazy innovative dude. He came up with so many ideas for the program. But the thing is, now imagine all those names on a piece of paper. What if they were different names? What if they were names who they didn't love it as much? Because the one thing that I'm realizing, talking to you, talking to Shamir, and myself even, the love that we have for what we do, that's what really matters, because that's what separates people who are just going to do this, toe the line, and dip out after a while, versus the people who, no matter what, it'll always hold a special place in their heart, because that's how I feel about it.
I mean, if it was a role that we were paying out for a YMI, they'd be fired. Yeah. But like real talk, and I want to shout out like Crystal Edwards, who was also at DOE. So that was kind of like the trifecta, right? Like, as the Crystal was at DOE, Patrice was at CUNY, and I am at YMI. And so when we first started, you were like, why did I hear about any of this? And I'm like, it's 3 Black women that are in these spaces that are literally contending and dealing with misogynoir, which, for those that don't know, is the intersection of misogyny and the specific racism that Black women endure, which is very different than what Black men endure. And all of us are in many ways non-institutionalists. So we come from other spaces where we have the degrees and we have the training to do this work, but we also have a worldview and a mindset that is more expansive, and in some ways may have been a threat to some spaces. But again, I to your point, I think you're right. Like, I don't want to take away from the fact that in our space, so I'll be very honest, like I had very real conversations. Cyrus, as a tall Black man who was the ED at that time, I'm like, your job is to make sure that I can do my job.
Right.
And he did that.
Like a united front.
He had not only a united front, like he believed me. Like when I would say to him, like, this particular individual is making it hard for me to do this job, or I know she's not going to say anything, but such and such over at CUNY is also experiencing this, or such and such at DOE. Right. Cyrus recognized who he was, the privilege he had as being a man, the privilege he had as being an ED, and also believed that our experiences were not made up. And that's important to highlight. Working in city government on a municipal level, I think about the countless individuals that are trying to do their job, and every day they're faced with individuals that make it hard for them to do their job. Right. And they often go through it in silence. And if you do not have someone that's willing to exercise their privilege, willing to put themselves on the line, willing to be like, yeah, you could curse her out, but you're gonna have to curse me out first. Like, that was Cyrus. Also want to shout out Alexis Comfort. Alexis, white woman who was the chief of staff to Richard Bury, the deputy mayor. She too was also like at that time, and again, remember, this is the height of movement. So she's like, yo, put me in, coach. Anytime you dealing with, blah, 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 let me know. Now, it took her a minute. At times I would have to like convince her, at first. But after a while, when she was able to see the pattern of, we work in YMI, which in many ways by default means we have a very Black and brown team. There are things that we are experiencing that are different than other teams. Right. We're going to need you to intervene, because this is not about our feelings. This is about how city government is not functioning properly if people have to maneuver discrimination just to do their job. Right. And so she was like on it. And so I do sit with like, what it means for spaces to take a pause and reflect. And in some ways, this is like one of my first times reflecting. So I'm even sitting here like, oh my God, I didn't expect to be asked these like deep questions. But I do think it's important for people to know, for the public to know. And I will also say this as a Black feminist, as a womanist, I also always want to highlight that this program was not successful, solely because there were women, femme folk, queer folk, whomever, that put it on the line to say, this is what needs to get done. This was done because, again, getting back to that word community, a community made a decision of diverse beings, from Black, white, Latina, from all over different parts of upbringings and backgrounds, made a decision that if we're going to create an intervention strategy that's going to be believable to the community that in many ways statistically is experiences consequences that lead from school to prison, then we're actually going to have to like be that front line, and we're going to have to push the spaces that we work in to co-conspire with us to make this successful, because the first audience that was going to tell us if it was like basura or not, it was going to be men of color. Right. Like, real talk. Like, y'all be like, yo, who you trying to recruit, the Pope? Like, so we even like had questions like that, like what type of individual is DOE willing to hire? Like, that was a real, if a brother comes in like and sees a flyer and says, yo, I'm really interested in that. I remember I was a mentor, blah, 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 blah. Are you going to be looking at what he's wearing? Are you going to be looking at his vernacular? Or how are you vetting? So we had to really like get to like the mechanics of like, how do y'all recruit to begin with? What are y'all looking for? If someone doesn't have a master's, are they automatically, not qualified? We were able to work with Lehman College, which at that time I was teaching at that time as well at Lehman College, and they had an amazing like administration team that was like, we may be able to get men that are in different majors. You said you were in engineering, but if they are able to take some teaching courses as a minor, we will credential that. So we were getting really creative as to how do we look at credentialing differently if you want to get into this program. So yeah, like we were definitely like, kicking whatever we could kick. But I think it's really important that, on the other side, it's really great to be congratulatory. Every time there's an article that comes out that's like, look how well it's going. I'm like, cool. But I do think that like the struggle of how you get to any type of like successful equitable outcome, or to an extent, even the ones that aren't successful, it's really important that you focus on like how equipped was the team to actually build this out. And also really understanding what the fight of a team is, and even the fight of the community. Because as you say, you're coming in to a space where brothers can be vulnerable and they can connect with each other. That means that on their own, individually, they're going through a fight. But that also means that young people who look like them are also going through a fight. So without you all creating that space as adults, where's the space for young people to also have that outlet? So the beauty of that is, I know that the more of us that are in these spaces that are able to discuss our trauma, discuss what it means to maneuver these systems, then you all are going to be the ones that are the creators of innovations to allow young people to also have those avenues, which in many ways don't exist in mass.
And I think that's a very important point to focus on, because a lot of my colleagues, my peers who I've went through the program with, who are actual teachers now, I talk to them all the time, they all have their unique way of relating to their kids. For me, it was in the morning, we would have like a 1 hour homeroom where I talk about our feelings. I'd just be like straight up, I'm not feeling good today, or I'm feeling great today, or we would all have an open forum about it. That would be my way of connecting. For some of my other colleagues, what they would do, they would draw with their kids. They would talk to their kids about what's going on with them. But that was the one common theme that I noticed. We all would ask our students, what's up, what's going on? And we never unnecessarily penalize them. Like, I remember there was one kid in my class who just kept coming in, hoodie, head down, nonstop. Originally, my train of thought would have been, well, they're disrespecting me. They're not, paying attention. But then after being in all these spaces and after learning and kind of like unlearning what was done to me, I realized that, well, there were times when I was a kid, I didn't really feel that great. So I talked to the kid and I was like, well, what's up? What's happening? I didn't want to call him out in front of anybody, because that's also embarrassing too. That's like emasculating for a guy, and if for a woman student too, it's still embarrassing. So then when I talked to them and pulled them to the side, it was because they were hungry, they didn't get much sleep last night. There's so many things that happen in a kid's life that we can't even fathom, but the least we can do is offer them grace. But then I feel like because of the stigmatization of Black and brown students and the policing of them, it seems like, okay, if they're doing anything that's like remotely quote unquote disrespectful, they'd get sent to the principal's office. Growing up, that's all that happened. I never really had teachers who talked to my elementary and middle school, because in my elementary and middle school experience, it was primarily white women who were my teachers. In high school is when I finally started to get more men of color as teachers. But through my elementary and middle school, all I ever saw were students getting sent to the office, coming back, and they do the same shit. It really didn't change anything. But what it did was it provided the instructor at the time just temporary relief. But in reality, if you're just giving yourself temporary relief, you're not solving the problem. In fact, you're just exacerbating it. And it reminds me of this one student. His name's Aiden. He used to punch everybody, like nonstop, just punch them. I don't know what was good with him, but we had a after school, and this is when I was doing a fellowship in the Bronx, and we had an after school program, boxing. So I was like, idea. And my cooperating teacher was also saying he doesn't do any work. So I was like, I got this. So I took the boxing mitts and I was like, all right, let's quiz you. And for everything you get right, you get to punch the mitts. So that's how we started to connect, and that's how we started to bond. And then after that, he was so enthused with all the work. He'd always do his work. He'd stop punching the kids, but he had to leave after 2 weeks. And when he left, I was the only one he gave a hug. So I was hype. I was like, okay, that's great. But he gave me a hug. And he's like, oh, Mr. Kabir, I'm going to miss you. And he wrote me a little letter. I still have that letter in my office. And it's cute because what people would deem a bad kid is just a child who doesn't know how to properly focus their energy. And so they shouldn't be reprimanded for that, because they're learning just as much as we're learning. And as an adult, I'm still learning new things every day. So I can only imagine how, as a child, you're learning so many new different things every day, and you're learning yourself. You need to be given extra grace in addition, as opposed to adults.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the work that I do, with my team at Pink Cornrows is helping industries really reflect on what white dominant culture really means.
Right.
It's very hard to accept that you are in a space that does such good work or on paper has a mission of doing good work, but everything in this country still comes from the same fabric of racism, right? There's no island of like teachers that is just like separate from racism.
Right, it's like untouched.
We've just discussed how the origin of teaching in this country, and I actually want to take it a step back. The origin of the first level of like mass assimilation of white dominant culture was towards, indigenous communities, right? After the genocide of, the adults and, the protectors of the land, you create a strategy to have young people adopt certain cultures and norms while also abandoning their own so that they could be more white.
Right.
And that's important to highlight that our education system has a focus. We call it education. And it's one of those words like justice that makes us feel good. But like when you really break it down as to like, what are the practices of justice? What are the practices of education? It don't make everybody feel good.
Right.
And we also are very blind to the statistics that specifically focus on Black and brown youth. So even at YMI, when I came there, I was like, I don't want anyone to make the assumption that just because this is called the Young Men's Initiative, that this is equitable. First of all, where's the Young Women's Initiative?
Right.
Doesn't exist. Second of all, when we say Young Men's Initiative, are we inclusive of young children that identify as non-binary, as queer? Are we looking at this from a traditional patriarchal standard of the ways that we want young people of color to look, especially young Black men and boys? So are we trying to groom people to wear ties and look presentable and basically not push back against the system? Then that means we're participating in the stereotypes. We're not disrupting anything. And as you can see, I probably was not one of the most liked individuals, depending on which way. Either you loved me or you didn't, because it's a challenge to a way of thinking that even before you were in your position, in your role, we all were taught that, like, when you're unsafe, what do? Call 911. You call the cops, right? When you have an issue, go to your teacher, tell your teacher, and it'll be okay. But if your teachers are the ones reporting your mom to ACS, is it okay, right? Like, so we recognize that NYC Men Teach was one opportunity, and one of many, but one opportunity where we were like, this is really about reimagining education, and in many ways in the spirit of now ancestor Congressman John Lewis creating good trouble, because what ended up happening is now you have a mass, not one or two or a trickling or sprinkling, but you've got a mass of individuals that have experienced some form of, even if it's not the same, almost all men of color have experienced some form of shared trauma, some form of shared oppression, and now they're in an industry that race and ethnicity wise is mostly white, and also has some gender dynamics that, if we're honest with ourselves, are uncomfortable. And both things can be true. Teaching is a very undervalued profession. It is a profession where individuals sacrifice so much every day to make sure that young people have the basics that they need. And it's also a profession that happens to be mostly white women. So when I see things like school to prison pipeline, or I see statistics around discipline, and I see statistics around which young people are advancing and which ones are dropping out, I know for a fact that if this was a profession full of Black people, y'all would be talking about how the Black people are not educating young people. But this doesn't necessarily mean that the conversation should end around, who is teaching. It's really about, how are we training teachers? Are we seeing equity as a professional requirement? Are we having people do their own self-work before they come into the classroom? And as you were talking about looking at a young person and saying, sure, this could be them trying to be defiant, but what if it's something else? just having that question alone could determine whether that young person is going to be gifted and talented or is going to be seen as quote unquote a delinquent. But that is a decision that is made by adults every day. And so I want us to like own the fact that when we enter into these spaces, all of us are in spaces that were designed before we were born to carry some type of advancement of white culture, whether we acknowledge it or not. And teaching is actually one of those very stark ones that it's obvious, but as a nation, we haven't really talked about. We haven't really focused on that because it's going to make a lot of people mad, understandably so. But I always like to say to folks, it's not necessarily your fault, but the question is, once you're aware of it, what do you do about it?
Because it's interesting you mentioned that, and I'm gonna mention this and then move to the. Because it's funny, I had like a bunch of questions. I'm like those questions, you know, like
go to the questions.
We'll probably skip it because this conversation is so great. Because when you're talking about like that white dominated culture, especially in education, it brings me back to one specific moment when I was in kindergarten, and there were two books, Brown Bear and Polar Bear. And we had to say the national pledge every day. And mind you, so my kindergarten teacher was like an older white woman, and every day there would be this one kid who would always get the Polar Bear book, and I was always stuck with the Brown Bear book. I don't know why that irked me, because I wanted to get that Polar Bear book so bad. Then one day, I get the Polar Bear book, and as I'm reading it, we got to see the pledge. I'm like, damn. So then I'm standing on the book, so he can't take it from me. He yanks it from my feet and gives me Brown Bear. Eventually, I get the Polar Bear, right, and I read it. And to my like astonishment, like I was a kid, but I realized, I'm like, this is the same book. The only difference is the color scheme. Literally, word for word, everything was the same.
Wow.
It was just one was a polar bear and one was a brown bear. So, you know, some of the scenery would be different, but the exact words was the same plot happened, the same, you know, whatever conflict the bear faced, same exact thing. And then now that I'm older, I always think about that moment because I'm like, why was I so hell-bent on getting polar bear? But it's because, like, the topics you're talking about. Throughout my life, I have very similar moments like that where I'm like, why was I so hell-bent on doing this? But it's because that's what was pushed upon me when I was younger. And during my formative years, the people who were my instructors were people who perpetuated that. So, for example, like my kindergarten teacher, she could have easily, like, I'm sure she's seen this dude yank it from my feet and whatever, and she could have intervened like, yo, kids, these are the same books. The only difference is just the color of it, and that doesn't matter. But no such intervention. So you got to think, like, how many instances like that do kids go through with zero intervention? And kids do this thing where self-fulfilling prophecy. If you keep telling a kid, yo, you ain't shit, you're not this, you're not whatever, well, of course they're going to end up believing the authority figure because they will relinquish control and assume, okay, you're the authority figure, so you know better. So if you think I'm this and I think I'm otherwise, who am I to judge what you're saying, what I'm saying and you're saying? I'm just going to relinquish control to you because I deem you to be smarter than I am. So when you have these people in these positions of power, oftentimes teachers not resonate with the students they have, well, now they're going to have an abuse of power. And it reminds me of another instance in kindergarten. I don't know, I was a badass kid in kindergarten, you know, and I got in trouble.
But maybe you weren't.
No, I actually wasn't. You know, I feel like for me, it was, I didn't understand because one time I was in timeout in the corner, and this is the one thing that got to me, right? I was in timeout. I had my head down. Now the teacher, so I think a kid said something, and the teacher is like, "Oh no, we're not gonna send them to the principal's office. We're gonna get the president, this or whatever." And I'm like, why are you saying all this shit? And literally like some Guantanamo Bay shit to the point where I'm crying, inconsolable, hysterical. And then I get older, and I'm like, that was messed up. Like, I was in kindergarten, right? And I'm in the corner. I'm already in my timeout, head down. Like, I'm not, being defiant anymore, or I'm not doing anything. But now you guys are escalating. Oh, principal's office. No, let's tell the mayor. No, let's tell the president. No, Guantanamo Bay. I'm like, yo, what is that going to do to a child, right? And so thinking about moments like that, there are so many people, and this is my view on trauma. Trauma makes or breaks some people, but the making or breaking of a person, it doesn't reflect how strong they are. To me, I look at it as some people just react to trauma differently. For me, trauma didn't break me, but it ended up giving me more inspiration to move forward and do what I needed to do. But for some people, trauma breaks them, and that's not, like, there's nothing wrong with that. Wrong in the sense of, like, it's not a reflection of their ability, but more so the system itself failing them and not giving them the tools, or just not giving them the trauma to deal with it to begin with,
I mean, trauma is such an interesting... when I see how our country right now there's a real war against, what education is going to make it into the classroom. People are using the term critical race theory completely wrong,
Right.
but they're categorizing anything that is basically mostly black and non-white as being evidence of critical race theory, which is a genius strategy when you think about what they're also doing is they are branding critical race theory as something that is, evil,
Right.
and demonic,
Right.
and in some ways like this is a trick, right? But it's also an extension of this, this false trauma of imagination. The imagination for a lot of the quote unquote forefathers of terror in this country is what happens if they fight back.
Right.
It's an infatuation that I don't necessarily think about, you don't necessarily think about, our families aren't thinking about, but the people that have always been in power think about it to the point that this trauma, or what ends up being the focus, is these learning materials that are intended to unify us as a country versus the real trauma of what people experience on the other side of oppression. So when I think of trauma, it's not just about, and especially when we talk about trauma in education, I think about it as like there's traumatic experiences and events, there's trauma, and then there's how do we treat trauma? How do we respond to trauma? Trauma-informed responses. And I feel like, and every individual all of us as humans, as human beings, our lives are always going to be filled with traumatic experiences. Whether it amounts to trauma or not, to your point, really has to do with how that individual, a whole range of things. I recommend people read The Body, The Body Keeps Score.
Oh, shit. I read that book, actually. Oh, I'm starting to read it recently.
Yeah, but, it's important to really think about how, two people can go through an earthquake and that's a traumatic experience. But one could, by sheer fact of just moving the chair that doesn't fall on a young person, they're going to be seen as a hero. And that's going to be the thing that moves them and propels them and gives them hope. And then another person who really had an experience of, oh my goodness, I felt like I was going to die. Any moving, rocking motion could trigger, that experience. So you're absolutely right. Individuals have ways of moving through traumatic experiences, but I don't want to minimize the fact that the trauma that is happening through systems and happens to mass communities is not one about individuals making choices as to this is racist, but I'm going to overcome this today. No, and I think that in some ways, the way that even our education system is set up, the way that our messaging is set up is bad things may happen to you, but if you just pick yourself up by the bootstraps, you'll be fine. And it's
exactly,
no,
right,
the statistics show that there's a lot of bad shit happening to the same people. There's not enough boots or straps out there. We really got to figure out if people are able to respond to the trauma, to the mass trauma of not only what they experience, but what their parents experience. And so we have, in my opinion, we have an ill-equipped force. It's not about the people, but the training is not set up to really prioritize the truth about trauma as it relates to systemic racism. And the crazy thing is we are so accustomed to responding, to being more reactive when people say, yo, this is racist. That's what gets more attention versus being do you know what racism means to a child? As you were telling these stories and you were like, yo, I was a badass kid when I was in kindergarten. I always stop people to say, you know what's so wild? It's not only just the kid that's experiencing that, it's all the kids that are watching the kid.
Right, because they make an example out of you.
They make an example out of you, and we all get convinced as to which kids are the bad kids.
Right.
So I had this weird theory as to what if the kids that ended up being suspended were actually the kids that were right? And my friends were like, what are you talking about? I'm like, what if the kids who knew, even if they didn't know, but in their spirit, their ancestors, they knew, yo, we're treated like shit and I'm not standing for it. So every time they disrupted, every time they yelled, every time they interrupted the teacher, it was something in them that was like, I'm allergic to the fact that I am not in a system of education. I am clear what this is about. And I already know you're going to kick me out. So you, and I'm out this bitch, right? Like, what if those young people were the way we should have been, because the rest of us really didn't get an education, but we did learn how to conform. We did learn how to respond to systems. We do know what it is to be, to be told or to be felt like if you decide that you're gonna lash out or you're gonna say something to this manager, you know what the consequence is. But also, don't get too bright, don't be too smart, because you know that they're fragile. So if you get if you shine too much, then you may go from pet to threat. And so I just think that we have to really, really investigate who we deem as bad. There's a reason why the baby doll test is a test that keeps getting repeated. And every time you repeat it, when you talk about the polar bear and the brown bear, like when I think of what it means for 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds who are Black, who see dolls and not only prefer the white doll, but when they give adjectives to the Black doll, automatically it's bad, automatically it's ugly, automatically it's mean. 3 and 4-year-olds repeated 50 years later right here in Brooklyn, and the same result. That means that there are messages all around us that are telling us and continue to reinforce that we are not good enough. And that's the first level of education. Then you get into a school system when what do young people really want? They want attention, they want to be cared for, and they want to be liked. So you're going to do things and really conform to be in any of those 3 spaces. But oh my goodness, those percentage of young people that are like, it. There's something really interesting about young people that don't get educated in our formal education system, because it's not that they're not learning, and it's not that they don't have something to show us. It's that they don't fit in this space that wants to control them. They refuse to be controlled. And they deserve an education, but where do they get educated? We're not equipped to educate all types of young people. And to me, if you can't educate all types of young people, you do not have an education system.
And it's I should have been like, we should just make this a 3-hour episode or something, because we got like about
I get passionate about this. This is why I also don't teach no more, because I'm just like I can't. Because
we got about like a handful of minutes of like maybe 5, 6-ish, which is crazy, because I'm like, damn, someone like I love all my guests, I'm
cool
but like
with this
some of my guests I'll be like, damn, I gotta like stick to my questions. This I was just like, man, screw the questions, but I got one question, and then you can get your shout outs. But one question that I want, of course, but one question I want to ask you before we move to the final stretch of this segment, which is, what are your goals for the future? Because we were so heated and passionate. I was just like, nah, like I just need to know, like, what do you got planned?
Goals for myself, for society,
everything, man.
I don't like. I am probably not the person that people should model for a lot of reasons, because my goal for myself is like more rest. My goal for myself is like, being in loving spaces, being safe, creating more safe spaces, creating more creative spaces. I have a tattoo on my back that translates to like building something from nothing. Like I know, I've always known I'm a creator. So I just, my goal is to be healthy enough to live as long as I can, to continue to create, knowing and leaning into like the comfort of the uncomfortability of what it means to build in spaces that don't want me to be there. That is just my purpose. When I think about what a lot of, I have 4 degrees, and I tell people all the time, I have 4 degrees not because I think I'm smart or I'm trying to be smarter than you. I have 4 degrees because in many ways, that's what I needed so that people wouldn't fuck with me. Yeah. And they still fuck with me. I just have more facts than most people, right? But a goal of mine is to not feel like I need that armor. I shouldn't have to need that armor. An everyday person shouldn't need that to have their livelihood be met. And so I work very hard on how do we support individuals whoever they are to ensure that they are enough to disrupt what they felt like had to be, right? That we can change the status quo, but it does require some bravery, and it also requires some like real strategic. Everything that I mentioned was like passion and strategy, right? Like you got to be smart about how you disrupt, and also like think about X, Y, and Z while you're doing ABC. I do have a book coming out this fall called The Equity Mindset, and in a lot of ways it is the combination of practices, rambles, journeys. I have my own, childhood moments where I, similar to you, I was like, I know I'm being treated differently, but it's that weird power struggle that young kids go through as to like, there's nothing I can do about it. I don't want to get in trouble with my parents. All these different questions, but also like, how do we take all of our experiences and combine it to like have what I call an equity mindset, which is like a mind fixed on doing the most we can with what we have in the spaces that we're in, and not treating it as like a 1, 2, 3, these are the things you need to do, but really honoring the complexity of what we've all endured up until this moment. So I don't care if that means you're a white man from Kentucky or a black girl like me from Trenton, an Indian a young man from Queens.
Nah, sorry, I said the record. I know Shamir said India. Yo, this dude keeps getting it wrong. I'm Bengali.
I'm gonna blame that on Shamir.
I keep telling him.
How wrong is that? You should have corrected him. He said it like 3 times.
Bro, I know. Every time he says that, I'm like, yo, Shamir, you know where I come from,
That's
bro.
huge. And our first,
you give me an earful. You tell him like, yo, Shamir, buy him a bottle of Henny to make up for it.
Shamir, you're gonna have to. I hope they don't edit this out. You're gonna have to fix that. But like, what it means around our unifying struggle, like white supremacism. Not white people, not white, but white supremacism, the belief that white is supreme is not benefiting any of us.
Of course.
So my goal is like, once we, like, how do we enroll more people to understand that, then recognize that like justice, education, love, safety, those things can then actually be real, but they can't be real if you're too afraid to confront that. It's just not. So that's my work.
So honestly, Ify, this was like I say this a lot, but like I truly feel like this was one of my favorite episodes to film. Please, everyone else, don't hate me. But what I will say is, feel free to give your shout outs to anyone you want to thank, anyone you want to recognize, to your camera over there, and then we'll wrap up this segment.
Yeah, thank you. I want to thank you. First of all, thank you for this invitation, this interview. Thank you, Shamir, for thinking of me. Although, our brother over here is Bengali, he's not Indian. And also like all the femme folk that I mentioned, that were a part and still a part of building amazing programs in this city, especially our Black and brown sisters that every day are being ignored but are pushing through. Like, the city needs you, and in many ways doesn't deserve you, but thank you for all your sacrifices and for what you've done. I wasn't prepared to give any shout outs, but I have to give a shout out to my Pink Cornrows team and also my Black Policy Lab team, and of course to everyone who has gone through the NYC Men Teach program, including my homeboy who didn't go through the program, who's actually a director of the program, William Anders. We went to high school together. Like, just y'all are, this is not just about men. This is actually about equity, and it's about how we actually are unapologetically led by individuals that not only know the struggle, but they know how to get over the hurdles. So that's it. Thank you.
I appreciate it. And with that being said, 2 things. One, I'm actually linking with William later today for the New York City Men Teach alumni social. But the other thing is, if you guys want to check out Shamir's episode, the dude we keep referencing, that's episode 1 of season 1. If you want to check out William's episode, the guy she just mentioned, that's season 1, episode 3. But with that being said, I truly thank you for coming out today. It was a great experience. And with that being said, that wraps up episode 4 of season 2 of Education in Color. I'll see you guys next time for episode 5. Take care.